This morning I want to begin by just asking a simple question. It's a very simple question. Where's the cross? You might think it's a bit of an odd question, and in some senses I guess it might be. But when you think about that question, where is the cross? The reason I want to ask that is because I want each of us to look and see if we see it. See if we know where it is. We've come together this morning, we've not but just very few minutes ago. We have partaken of the fruit of the vine, the unleavened bread, which represents to us the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. But do we know where the cross is? What I mean by that is, think about what's in your mind. Think about what was in your mind a few moments ago. Think about what's in your mind as you go through your daily lives. Do you see the cross, or does the cross kind of get lost in everything that's going on around you? Do you lose sight of the cross because of your work or because of your family or because of your hobbies or because of whatever it might be? Do you lose sight of where the cross is? You know, a lot of times we think we see the cross and we think, oh, I know where the cross is. And it's kind of like what we talked about in our Bible class in the auditorium this morning. It's at the church building. You know, I know where the cross is. It's on Sunday mornings. And we're not really looking at the cross. Sometimes we intellectually know about the cross, but we just forget about it. We just don't look at it anymore. But the cross is vital. It's the very center of everything about what's going on in our spiritual lives. You know, the Apostle Peter, that's the way he introduced Christianity, if you will. That's how he introduced Christ to the people on the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 2. It's not that they didn't know who Jesus was. Most of them had been right there and had probably seen him. But yet he had to explain to them about the cross and how the cross related to them. Verse 36 of Acts chapter 2, "Therefore let all the house of Israel know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ." That is, Lord, and He's the anointed one. "This Jesus whom you crucified." Peter wanted them to understand what the cross was all about. He wanted them to see the cross. Now, a lot of them probably had seen the cross, literally. But he wanted them to understand what it really meant to know what the cross was. The Apostle Paul, as he explained what he preached, he said, this is the focus. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2, "For I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified." That was the focus. That was the point. Well, if the cross is right at the middle of everything spiritual, if Peter says Jesus has been crucified and He's been made Lord and Christ, if Paul says the only thing I want to know among you is Jesus Christ and Him crucified, don't you and I need to make sure that we understand where the cross is? Don't you and I need to answer this question for ourselves? Where's the cross? Don't we need to spend some time looking at the cross, thinking about the cross? You know, if you think that you know where the cross is and that it's located on a hill outside of Jerusalem, well, you're missing some stuff. I mean, yes, we see engravings like this old one from Gustave Doré that began appearing in Bibles, nearly 200 years ago. You know, we can see paintings and we think, oh yeah, I know, I see the cross. I can visualize that. But there's still some things you're missing. Yes, it was on a hill, Golgotha, there close to Jerusalem, close to the entrance of Jerusalem. Yes, there were 3 crosses up there, and we can kind of visualize that in our mind. But I want you to think about where the cross really is, all right? I want you to understand the cross is right in the midst, right smack in the middle of violence. We think about Jesus Christ and He's the Savior of the world, and we have this real pristine image somehow in our mind, spiritually speaking, religiously speaking, the world around us in general does, about we've got this wonderful cross. Well, where is the cross? Well, it's right in the midst of the most violent episode that you can imagine. This morning, almost all the scriptures we're going to look at are from the 27th chapter of Matthew. You may want to turn there and read along with me. The beginning place in our text that I want us to notice, we could back up to the very beginning. We're going to skip back and forth in Matthew 27. But to begin with, we want to look at the 22nd and 23rd verses. We want to notice the people who were present. Yeah, there are people all around the cross, but what kind of people are there? What are they looking for? Well, they're looking for violence is what they're looking for. Verse 22, Pilate has Jesus before the people. Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" They all said, "Crucify him." Got a big exclamation point. They're yelling, they're screaming, "Crucify him." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they kept shouting all the more, saying, "Crucify him." Crucifixion is violent. We don't have anything like that in our country today. Crucifixion is just super violent, super torturous, bloody, evil, almost we can say. And these people understood it. They knew what crucifixion was. They knew how violent a death that was. They knew how bloody a death that was, because before you were put on the cross, you were beaten, and they understood all of that. They knew that. They knew it was going to be bloody. They knew it was going to be bad. Look how they responded then in verse 25. After being asked, "Are you sure that you want to do this?" And Pilate saying, "I'm innocent of this man's blood." Then what did they say in verse 25? And all the people said, "His blood shall be on us and our children." In other words, we're going to be responsible. We want violence. We want to see death. We want to see this crucifixion. We think about the Roman Empire and we talk about all the things that the Romans involved themselves in. The violence that went on in the Colosseum, for instance, and other places, where they had animals tear people to pieces or where they had gladiators fight. Hey, these people that day in front of Pilate, when Jesus was there, were no different. Crucify him. Kill him. Put him to death. The soldiers joined right in. It wasn't just the Jews that day. It wasn't just a crowd of Jews. The Roman soldiers joined right in. Yes, they were commanded to scourge Jesus. They were commanded to do that. That was their duty as soldiers. There in verse 26, Pilate, you remember, released Barabbas to the people. He gave the people a choice. Said, "Do you want this man who's a criminal, a murderer, and an insurrectionist? Do you want him or do you want Jesus?" They said, "We want Barabbas. Crucify Jesus." The soldiers then scourged Jesus, and Jesus was handed over to be crucified. But the soldiers went even further than that. They went beyond the call of duty. They were violent people too. They went beyond that. You remember what they did? They took a bunch of thorns, and we're not talking about little bitty briars. We're talking about big old sharp thorns. They took these thorns and they wove them into this crown, and then they shoved it down on his head. But they didn't even stop at that. They shoved the crown down on his head, and then it says in verse 30 that they spat on him and took a reed and began to beat him on the head. Put the crown of thorns on his head and then started hammering it into him with the reed that they had given him for a scepter to make fun of him. So you see here you have these soldiers, these elite soldiers of the guard. They're there. You see these people are Gentiles, but then you have on the other hand the crowds, the religious leaders of the Jews, God's own chosen nation. As we look back in history, His chosen people, that nation that God had said, "I'm going to take care of you if you'll follow me." And what are they doing? They're rejecting Jesus. These people all join together in this violent, savage, brutal episode. But where's the cross? Right in the middle of it. Jesus came to this earth and He hung on that cross right in the middle of all this violence. It wasn't some nice, pretty place. It's not a nice, pretty place where the cross is. It's in the midst of violence. It's also in the midst of vice. I think we understand what vice is, and this isn't the vice spelled the other way where you put something in it and tighten something down to hold something. This is vice, the bad vice. The Oxford Dictionary defines it as immoral behavior or a weakness of character or behavior, a weakness of character. Well, what was going on around Jesus? Just even on a what we might think of a small level, think about the soldiers. They had already been engaged in violence and all of that, in scourging Jesus and in beating Jesus and that sort of thing. But one passage that we want to look at that's not in the Gospel of Matthew, but from over in the Gospel of Mark, you find that, we won't turn there and read it, but you find there in Mark 15, it talks about how and it talks about it in other places as well, how that what they did was, the soldiers, they gathered together there, and they had taken Jesus' clothes, and they started parting the garments among them. They were gambling, casting lots to see what each man would get to take. So here, after engaging in all of this violence, and in seeing what was going on, seeing the man hanging on the cross, beat nearly to death with scourging, and instead of just tying him to the cross, nailing him to the cross, and they're sitting right there at the foot of the cross. You talk about weak character. Say, well, what a wonderful place to sit here and gamble. We're going to cast lots. We're going to gamble for his clothes because I want this and you want that. Well, let's just cast lots for it. Now, that's some pretty weak character. That's vice. And where's the cross? Right there. It's right there. Jesus is right there in the midst of the violence. He's right there in the midst of the vice. But because of the weakness of the character of the soldiers, they also engage in another step, if you will. The cross is right in the middle of mockery and blasphemy. The soldiers, back into our regular text here of Matthew 27, beginning in the 27th verse, the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And then hear what we noticed before. And after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand, and they knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" The soldiers were mocking Jesus. Jesus the Christ, the very one that Peter says has been made both Lord and Christ, the very one of whom Paul said, "I want to know nothing among you except Jesus and Him crucified." Where's the cross? It's right in the middle of the mockery of these soldiers. "Hail, King of the Jews!" Put the robe on him, make him a crown, give him a reed, make fun of him. That's where the cross is. But it wasn't just these Gentiles. It wasn't just these Roman soldiers who probably, for the most part, had really no background or understanding of what was going on with Jesus Christ. It was actually the people too, who knew, who had seen Jesus, who had heard Jesus. Verse 39 of the chapter, "And those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads and saying, 'You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross.'" That's where the cross is, right in the middle of this mockery and this blasphemy. Blaspheming Jesus, the Son of God. But guess what? It's not just the Gentiles. It's not just the people who have been incited to this